Okay, so the recording is started, and thank you all for coming out tonight. We are going to meet with some representatives from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. We're going to talk a little bit about seeking designation on the National Register of Historic Places with us. At the end, there'll be a little time where you can ask some questions. When we get to that point, I will ask that you step up to the podium just so they can hear you better. You should be able to hear them because all of these TVs will be using their own audio, but this is the only microphone that they have. So if you'll step up to the podium, that would be great. Um, and our superintendent is actually advocating in the Capitol up in Salem for public schools, but he is joining us remotely. So Mr. Roberts, if you're there, if you'd like to say a word or two.
Yes, hi, good evening. I don't need any I'm Gary Robbins. I'm the Superintendent of Schools for Coos Bay. We're to have everybody here. I apologize again on this consent. Got exciting. You know, I'm actually jumping the few one meeting to getting back to my room and have a meeting. So I'm going to switch from back and forth to my phone to computer. I apologize. But thank you again for being here tonight. Really look forward to hearing the presentation and what this could do for acoustic festivals and our
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Roberts. And we have Katie Abrams and Robert Olgan of the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. They're going to start with a little presentation.
Thanks, Devin.
Well, and I apologize. I'm David Kegley. I'm the Assistant Superintendent School Board here at Houston School Day.
Can we pass around paper so that if somebody wants to contact or board numbers have it?
Yes. So I'll put a sheet at the back. I'll put your name and your email address, and I can send you the contact.
Steven, would you let me know if a nice female showing up?
I'm sorry, Katie. What was that?
Oh, would you let me know if my screen is showing up all right?
It is. You are good to go.
Let's get started. My colleague Robert, he may be joining us later, and he can't make it. Though I'll just make it all part. But thank you all for coming. And thank you to Damon and Bay Public School District and Cricket Souls also for listeners. As he said, my name is Katie Abrams, and I work at the Oregon State Elder Innovation Office. And tonight, Robert, if he joins me, and I are here to talk about what it means to pursue a National Register nominee for a publicly owned property like Marshfield High School, or maybe like Cooler, what the effects of listing are, and what kinds of opportunities designation can open up. We'll also talk about the process of how a nomination moves from an idea to a completed listing and the resources that are available to help along the way, including a couple that are specialized places, which I think is really exciting. But first, I like to give a little background on the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO. SHPO is one part of a larger division called part of Oregon Parks and Recreation. Heritage does all kinds of on outreach side that use a random program, certified local government program, now on which they participate in, and also other things like the Oregon Street and Tour Corps. Over on the SHPO side, and now you have a register program. And then Robert, if he's been to work, both of us work in SHPO programs. The SHPO itself is a school function created by the National Historic Evaluation Act, which is the enabling legislation for a lot of preservation regulation programs, including the National Register. Every single state had a historic preservation office. That office's job to survey, inventory historic property, to review undertakings with their impact on historic properties, and to administer the National Register program, which is what I do. Every state has their SHPO set up a little bit differently, and they're their own department. Sometimes they're housed in other boroughs, like here in Oregon, where we're in, right? But in all states, the SHPO does pretty consistent. In the SHPO program that we're primarily tonight is that National Register Historic Places program. The official definition is good. They know information is that the National Register, an American official list of historic places significant in American history, architecture, geology, engineering, and culture. It's primarily honorary established by the federal government and the highest level of achievement by the National Park Service. The final decision on list what that is getting a lot of feedback. Let me know if it's new plan. So even though this is a federal program, there's a really strong local compliance with the National Register. Within each shipboat, it's a little team of people like me, whose job it is to help people with the administrative process for nominating new properties in our state to the National Register. There are currently over 500,000 properties listed in the National Register from the U.S. territory. And 2,100 of those, about more now, are located in Oregon. 55 of those are accounted for, and about half of that number per right here in Coos Bay really going to be there. All of these properties always mean they're listed in the register because someone went through the process on them, which included researching and writing a nomination form that was then reviewed by our office and a state committee, and then finally the national. Ultimately made that determination that each of these properties had all of the required dollars in their nomination form and met the requirements for the requirement. Essentially, a property requirement within the National Register. First, it needs to have what the Park Service calls significant. That falls into one or more of four criteria. Criterion A, or association with historic events or patterns of events. Criterion B, then for an association with the productive life of a significant person. Criterion C, for architectural or artistic or engineering merit, or as the work of a master architect, artist, or engineer. And criterion D for research or information potential. That last one, criterion D, is most commonly applied to archaeological sites. It can apply to other kinds of or significance. The significance, that's one of the two requirements. There's a second requirement is what the Park Service calls environmental. Like significance, integrity is a particular kind of jargon term or National Park Service usually works to mean something really specific when you use the National Register. They define it as the authenticity of a property's historic identity. So they say that in order to have integrity, not only does the property resemble its historic experience, it also has to material dimensions and structural aspects from the historic period. Okay. So there are kind of two parts to this. One is does the property look and feel like it did during the historic period? And then two, are there actual physical materials and design aspects as involved in the now period? They don't necessarily have any condition because integrity not the same. Those features still need to be implemented. Actually, you need to be surviving. They also need the property for society. So with a building like the Coos Bay Carnegie Library that was listed in the National Register in 1986, the features we'd probably think about when it comes to determining does this property have integrity would be things like intelligence, where people could easily access it, and design with the classic represent kind of a dual trait, real everyone will go with associated. Might be the materials that it's out of. They're really distinctive. Probably also, the it matters that it's area. There's a wires out to the part. All of the things makes build itself really story and for community library. Those kind of features that you hear about, things like the location. Those are things what Park Service calls character defining features. And I think it's important that having some alteration as listed in the National Register. These look exactly like that. A lot of properties that out in there this But when it comes to figuring out whether a property has enough integrity, it's more about whether those changes impact those character defining features and mostly still intact. So knowing a little bit more about what neurology and how can you should follow. We're gonna go over. So I know results will have time and the first question I asked is just why? Why are people interested in studying that? Are a lot of property and they that will just communities. One of the primary benefits is raising community awareness. The recognition for the resource can also be leveraged for marketing potential and public education, heritage tourism, community building, all sorts of things that reinforce the place. Properties that are listed in the National Register are also eligible for help support rehabilitation. These tools include federal and state historic renovation tax program. They're both available through free. And then also historic preservation program, like the Preserving Oregon grant, where you put toward rehabilitation. Designation also may allow waivers of certain legal and legal requirements from the interest of preserving and property integrity, like we just talked about. Another thing that people want, they start the process, why don't they need to pay restrictions on how they can use limiting or alter property in the for private properties in Oregon. There's only regulation if they're dated with the National Register done legal vendor that local governments will turn into review proposal relative or follow properties and demolish or relocate. This is required by our statewide on goal, the National Historic Public Resources. And the idea behind it is about not a prohibition on demolition or relocation. Oh, hi, Robert. And as far as things like the diner and alteration, an important thing to remember your judging different local historic and local and local regulations are always all that kind of designation in place through a separate local process. Well, National Register nominee would have no problem. So if you're interested in designating and what it might mean for you, that's a great thing to check out with your city partner. And Robert showed up just in time. I would love if you, Robert, can talk about a couple of other regulatory situations.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sarah. There, join me. I'm Robert Olguin, early on Historic Preservation Office. I'm in our compliance between earlier. Well, mostly what we do is we interact with the federal laws, so on the regulations, or and so as that I've been talking about have something that is publicly owned. There is sort of an additional caveat to sort of what Katie was just talking about. When there's a public owned building, the obligations through state law, and that is ORS 358653, relates to public agencies or political subdivisions of the state consulting with our office. Just essentially, if there's changes to a building that's deemed historic, it's being sold out of public ownership, it's being demolished, all those types of things, there's a consultation process to talk about what's going to happen next. That applies whether or not we have a designation through something like the National Register. So if the criteria is more, is it a 50 years old or older type of building? And we go from there. Regardless if there's a designation or not, that's not going to change whether this law applies or not. So it's a separate process. And similarly, there's federal laws. I won't go into those, but essentially if there's federal funding or permission or some sort of permit, some approval of some sort, a federal agency is required to consult with our office on a historic property. That's a lot of times locally, that might be like pass-through money from a federal grant or something that we would review. The one thing I'll just add here too is the benefit of listing, however, is it makes either of these processes a lot easier, faster. It can streamline that because we already know certain things that are laid out in that designation of why it's important and what are the parts of the building that are most important. And I'll note that Coos Bay School District has gone through these processes in the past with us, including Marshfield High School's auditorium and gym when the seismic retrofit happened there, and consulted with their office and went through that entire process. So we've been there and done that before. Yeah. Practically.
Thanks, Robert. So one more common question that's also kind of related to public ownership that we throw out in here is whether a property can be listed in the National Register if the person who has legal title to the property isn't in support. So in the case of privately owned property or a district that has a lot of privately owned properties, the National Park Service will not list the property or district in the National Register if a simple majority, more than 50% of the property owners object to that designation. In the case of public property, it's a little bit different. Public agencies who own a property that's being nominated for the National Register can still share a support or objection for a nomination, but the consent is not required, and a property can be listed without support of the public property owner. So knowing all of that, the next question we get is usually, how do you do it? What's the process for nominating something to the National Register and getting it listed? The entire process from idea to listed usually takes about a year for a single individual property. It can be shorter or longer depending on where you're starting from, whether the nomination is being written by someone who has experience or somebody who's new to the process, and just what the schedule of that preparer is, whoever's doing the work and what their room looks like. You have a lot of flexibility to do a nomination on your own timeline. The first step is always to make a plan and decide things like what that timeline is going to be and who's going to be preparing the draft nomination. Anybody can prepare a draft nomination. You can engage a volunteer, you can do it yourselves. You might choose to hire a consultant. If you are interested in that, you'll also want to think about funding because the cost of a nomination generally runs about a few $1,000s to complete all of the research and the writing, the revision required. It's usually about 100 to 150 hours, so it can be kind of expensive. The city of Coos Bay, as a certified local government, can apply for funding for something like this through a certified local government grant, which is a matching grant that's administered by Oregon Heritage for preservation work. Applications are open now. That's one avenue to consider. You might also consider planning fundraisers, alumni events, other things that make sense for your community and for the resource. When you have ideas about your plan, or if you have questions as you're making your plan, the next step is to set up a meeting with me where we'll talk through the process and how I can support you in meeting your timeline and goals. So in this meeting, I'm typically going to share some technical resources, sample nominations. You can see what you're working toward, and also the template to fill out for the nomination. If it's helpful, and especially if the preparer is someone who's doing this kind of work for the first time, we can also brainstorm an outline together. We can set up some soft deadlines for drafts or find other ways that will move the process forward for you in a way that's comfortable and works towards success. The next step, which is the biggest part of the timeline, is going to be to draft the nomination form. These are pretty extensive documents. You've got a few different parts. These are just the big ones. So a detailed written description of the property that explains its design and the materials and then any alterations that have happened over time. And a historic context, which includes background history, developmental history, how the property itself came to be, and then an argument or justification for its significance under one or more of those National Register criteria, A, B, C, and D, that we looked at. That justification section also needs to identify an area of significance from our set list that the Park Service provides. We'll share that with you if you're interested in the process. Also needs to identify a level of significance, local, state, or national, and then a period of significance, which is that period of time that property was actively associated with the story for which it's significant. So if we're talking about association with New Deal or Marshfield High School, it might just be the year of construction, the years that it was associated with those programs. Those are all things, though, that we would talk over in that initial meeting and then also back and forth as you prepare the nomination form. And the third kind of major component of the form is all the supporting documentation. So that Always includes a handful of required maps, always includes floor plans, site plan, and then photographs. And you can also slip in like fun things like historic photos and newspaper articles and other things like that. Once all of that information is together and the draft is complete, it needs to be submitted on or before one of the 3 deadlines for review. So those are March 1st, July 1st, and November 1st, although you're free to turn it in anytime to get some feedback. Those are the official formal deadlines. We review the draft at that time and we return a memo that has outlined revisions on it. Depending on your schedule and the revisions that are needed, the preparer could take a couple of months and submit it again for the next formal deadline. Or if you're able to make those changes in a week or two, then we move straight on to the next step, which is scheduling the nomination for review at the next meeting of the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation, or SACHP. The SACHP are a governor-appointed committee, 9 people with expertise in things like preservation and architecture and history and archaeology and museum studies. These are some of our wonderful members in this photo. And they meet 3 times a year to review and make recommendations on all the proposed nominations for Oregon properties. Their next meeting is actually 2 weeks from today, coming up. We set the agenda for these meetings and we open the public comment period 70 days in advance of the meeting. So 70 days before they meet, we send the draft to the local Historic Preservation Review Committee. So in Coos Bay, that would be the Coos Bay Historic Preservation Committee. And we invite them to provide a recommendation on whether or not the nomination meets the National Park Service criteria. At that time, we also formally notify the chief elected local official, federally recognized tribes, the property owners who usually, they know about this at this point, but it's a formal notification. And then we also notify the public that the comment period is open. We post the nomination on our website so anyone can read it. And we invite people to provide written testimony ahead of the SACHP meeting or to join us to provide testimony in person. When those 70 days are up, the SACHP has their meeting to review the nomination. Meetings are always public, and they usually happen in the second part of February. That's coming up June and October. And during that meeting, anyone can come and share testimony for or against a nomination. We recommend that at least the preparer, the person who wrote the nomination, and the owner or an owner's representative attends that meeting to answer questions and just represent the nomination for the committee. If you can't go in person, the meetings always have a virtual attendance option. So there's always a way that you can make it. The SACHP's review is going to focus on the same things that SHPO staff were looking for in reviewing the initial draft, which is why we have that revision period before the nomination gets scheduled for the meeting. So the things they're looking for basically are all the parts of the nomination complete, are they accurate, and then does the argument make sense? Does it make the case for eligibility according to those criteria that the Park Service set? Because that's also what the Park Service is going to be looking for at the end of this process. If the SACHP decides yes, makes the case, and they recommend the nomination, then the preparer has up to 90 days to make any final revisions based on their feedback and then any feedback that might have come from the local preservation committee or from the public or from SHPO staff. When those revisions are done, and again, you have up to 90 days, it can happen faster, staff send the nomination and digital copies of all the photos and all this pre-materials, any public comments and owner support or objections, send all of that to the National Park Service. And the Park Service then has 45 days to review. And if they determine that the nomination meets all the criteria and standards, they sign it and it's officially listed in the National Register. So even just looking at this slide, 70 days, 90 days, 45 days, that's like 7 months together. It gets pretty clear how this process can stretch out and take the better part of a year, maybe over a year, depending on how long it takes to get that draft ready. But I think the thing to emphasize is that's not all active time, right? Whoever's preparing the nomination is not going to be writing and revising that entire time. Most of the active time is going to happen up front before the nomination even gets scheduled and released for public comment. Knowing that, want to spend a little bit more time talking about resources that can help with that writing process. We are lucky we have a lot of technical resources from the National Park Service, and then we have a few that our office at SHPO we've made to help support nominations too. And then I mentioned earlier that Marshfield High School and Coos Art Museum, you're kind of lucky. You have a couple of additional tools that will help make that initial draft step a little bit easier than it would be for another sort of property. We're going to look at those first. The first one is the Oregon New Deal Resources from the PWA or WPA 1933 to 1943 Multiple Property Documentation Form, or MPD. I'm just going to call it MPD from now on, the mouthful. An MPD is a tool. It's like kind of like a reference document, is how I think of it, for evaluating National Register eligibility of properties that share a common historic context. So this MPD, the context we're looking at is New Deal programs, specifically Public Works Administration, or PWA, and Works Progress Administration, or WPA. There are two major components to this MPD and all MPDs. The first part are the historic context. So for this MPD, those are context of the Great Depression, the New Deal program, and then context of the architectural style of New Deal era resources. So one of those is more social political history, and one of those is more design history. This information is really helpful to have when you're writing a nomination, because it means that you don't have to re-research or rewrite the kind of general background information you need for your case. It's already been done in this document. In this MPD, it's previously been reviewed and approved by the National Park Service. So your nomination can actually just kind of reference this and move ahead and focus more on the specific history of your property. It's mostly because of this historic context component with MPDs that nominations that are written under an MPD or using an MPD as a resource are often shorter than other nominations, because all that initial background and context building has been done. And so whoever's writing the nomination can refer back to it instead of having to reinvent the wheel. That saves researching, it saves writing time. If you've hired a consultant for the project, it also saves budget. So this is a really good leg up. The second component of this and other MPDs is called property types and registration requirements. So this section identifies specific kinds of properties associated with the historic context. So there are a bunch of them for this MPD, tons of different kinds of New Deal era resources. The two that we're probably most interested in are post offices, things like the Coos Art Museum, and schools, like Marshfield High School. For each of those property types, the MPD also specifies what are called registration requirements. And those you can think of as like a checklist or like a framework for creating that eligibility argument. So making that justification that the property meets one of those criteria. So together, the historic context, property types, registration requirements, those are a really useful tool to help prepare a nomination for a New Deal resource like Marshfield High School. And actually, Coos Bay's newest National Register listed property, the Scout Cabin in Mingus Park, I hope some of you recognize this, that was listed just last year with the help of this MPD. The preparer of that nomination, Coco Sutton, this was her first nomination. She did a great job. She wrote a description of the building, and she researched and wrote about its development and she put a lot of great work into it. But she was also able to lean on the MPD's historic context for New Deal programs, for that rustic architectural style of the building, to provide that broader background. And then she also used the registration requirements for another property type that I didn't list here, but it's covered by the MPD, and that's lodges. So that helps her organize and justify the significance argument. And this got listed just last May. A couple other tools that can specifically support nomination: Marshfield High School, the Coos Art Museum, are previously completed documentation, and that provides property-specific information. So the MPD, that's a broad reference document that gives background and a leg up when you're discussing New Deal programs, but it doesn't really go into detail about these specific resources. Previous documentation does. So available on the SHPO database, or if you prefer, you can just email me. I'll share my contact information at the end of this, is previous documentation for Marshfield High School. The same historian who prepared the MPD, she also prepared this intensive level survey form. That's just the front page on the screen there. It has a building description, has a really detailed list of alterations that have been made to the building. And it has a bibliography, and historic photos, and all of those can be used as a starting point for a new nomination. For the Coos Art Museum, the front page of what we have for that. It was actually a 45-year-old rough draft of the National Register nomination. It's not complete, but it still has a partial building description, and it can be used as a starting point for that detailed description portion of a nomination that I mentioned. There are also some great photos showing what it looked like in 1980, and that might be helpful to puzzle out some of those more recent alterations that have happened in the last few decades. Okay, and then in addition to those content-specific resources, so the MPD of previous documentation, the Park Service also has a ton of technical guidance on their website. Again, I can share this. You can also just Google National Register publications. And the two foundational documents that I definitely recommend taking a look at are how to complete the National Register registration form and how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. If you want to learn more about the technical side of the National Register, if you're getting started writing a nomination, these are great places to start. The Oregon SHPO also has a supplement. It's available on our website called Preparing National Register Nominations in Oregon. And that provides some more specifics on things like formatting and organizing your argument. There's some tips for how to complete that building description, and then also more specifics on what maps and floor plans we need. That's also a good place to go. That is my contact information. Like I said, I'm happy to provide any of the resources I shared today or connect to chat one-on-one about potential nominations. But for now, I'm going to hand it back to David, and maybe we can take some questions. And the room is muted, so we need to unmute that before we can move to the question session.
Okay, sign up.
No, thank you.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. And does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Katie while we have her here? Feel free.
Hi, Katie. This is Cricket.
Hi, Cricket.
So I wanted to sort of have you publicize, because coming up on February 19th is the meeting, the State Advisory Commission. And if anyone has ever listened to what goes through when the nomination is much complete and they're reviewing it, I think that's really useful. Also, you have a special presentation on that day that a lot of people know who that is.
We do. Would you like to share a little more about our special leader?
I'll let you share it. I'll let you do it.
I think you know her better.
Oh, well, but tell them about how the review will be part of your thing on that night.
Yeah. So like for the next SBC meeting is on February 19th. They spread out across the city on the 19th, 20th. That meeting, the committee gets together. We usually have some training, a presentation, and then go to the guests to join each as of this meeting. We have 4 nominated from over the review. We have a high school, we have the House of Building, the author, have a building that's associated with the casket, and it's kind of interesting. And then the Carnegie Library and Eastern Library in Oregon. For the committee members, they'll get together, similar to the lead reviewer, so they're assigned to clear on just answer out. They'll talk through what they thought of the nomination, whether for requirements, what the national business said, whether the documentation is thorough enough, when and then they'll have a discussion. And there's kind of 4 different recommendations. They can either say, found it and looks great, send it to the so curious as is. Spoke commonly, they say, good, we want a few stronger, table it, or they could all generally by the time nominations make it to the SEC, they have a strong.
And you can look at what they've submitted. The agenda packet has information.
Yes. So like I said, when we open that public comment period, 7 days before the meeting, all of the nominations go online. Anyone can download them and read them. Testimony.
And I think it's fair to say Oregon Heritage has been working quite hard with their MPDs to identify buildings and places that should be on the register. And so that's some of the things you're making a point of doing, and things have changed a lot. And then also you have a presentation on why you should have a cemetery on the national. Like, let it this be presented by Becky Spoltz. $50. You want to get it on that Sun Thursday, I think, because it's a 2-day thing. You can also listen, and she'll have a things on why would you list a cemetery. So we'll get a plug in for the family as well.
Absolutely. The meeting will be live streamed on YouTube. And there are a lot of different ways and a lot of great ways to.
Hi, I don't really have a question, but more process. I'm MJ Kariba, and I actually serve on what's called the Design Assistance Team for the City of Coos Bay. We wear dual hats. We are the local Landmarks Commission. So when that draft goes to them and then they send it back to your local historic preservation group, it's the Landmarks Commission. So I and my fellow members will have that complete packet. We will have to review it, give it some of our comments to then go back to their office. So I get to review these. And I've seen a lot of them. Steve, I'm sure you've seen. I've actually worked in 3 different buildings that do have the National Registry. So I've been able to look at all of those documentations that got them on the National Registry. So I can't write it. I have to review it. So nobody tag your at MJ, okay? Things to bring. Okay.
Okay, I'm Abby Hutchison. I guess I'm an owner. I'm on the school board. One of my questions was about the cemetery and whether or not it was advantageous to move them together. So, but my first question is, does the number of previously designated historic places in a community affect your ability to then be designated?
The short answer is no. No. Robert, do you have a long answer?
I don't need a long answer.
No, okay. That's it.
Does anyone else have any questions?
So maybe they don't know that the cemetery is on it. Oh, yeah, it's light on it's the domination. Yeah, I just looked it up to see if it was. Yeah, it is. How long ago was that? Well, she was in college. Graduated here in 2008, so not 5 years. 13.
All right. Well, if no one has any further questions for Katie, thank you again for spending the evening with us doing this.
Yeah.
It's much appreciated. And I will share your contact info for those that weren't able to get it off the screen. I have them put their emails down, so we'll get contact info out and we'll continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for something correct.
Wait, one more question. She may have logged off. I think we lost them.
No,
Here you go, see it, please do something.
There's no mic. You just
Okay, I'm Crystal Shoji, and I work in planning in some small cities, and I've worked here. And my question is whether the nomination of a property on a federal register, how this has gone through the years. There's been a lot of fear of people that getting on the National Register will make things cost more or keep people from doing what they want to do at the building. And I'd just like you to comment on that.
yeah, I understand. There are a lot of ideas about what and learned. I mentioned that under Oregon Rule 5, the only restriction now associated with something like if the sheet in the National Register and the local government has to reject proposals to demolish or relocate the reserve. And then Robert spoke a little bit about the additional implications for publicly owned property. So implications are in place whether the property are eligible for the National Register or registered in the National Register. So listing doesn't change that situation. Robert, do you want to speak to it if you want anymore?
I would just add, a lot of misconceptions and are still out there. And a lot of it also is okay. It's involved in code, rules, regulations, all of that, at this point, probably 30 plus years ago, they're out and selling for fatty. You can be part of the art bag being listed, but it also requires you to be a viral tour of your property. And never done that for not games, but that's still out there. And so there's look of kind of how you have a designated pub and you can or not do. Reach out to Katie or Amy or something and just ask them permission. I don't find some way that there's really a lot of anything Brazil or what he was talking about with the girl to demolish it or real I just kind of talked about it for time and mercy.
So I have another comment that maybe you can address, and I don't remember the ORS number, but there are some modifications that can go through because you are listed historically. So they're going to be they're not going to be safety things, but there's some things that they could be a little more lenient of, and maybe you can address that a little bit.
Yeah, there is the possibility of getting on the creators for consideration. Will be listed in the National Register, considered as a art resource for the interest of preserving that resource. That very
So, and we do have a historic district that didn't meet the property owners accepting it. So if they decided to do it again, because it's been quite a while now since that was submitted, what would be the procedure for that? If they does it have to be reviewed again to see what changes have been made on that street, or how do they go about that if those property owners would decide to flip?
the process would start again at the beginning. We're going to have documentation. We'll have a study point that we're in. For districts, though, we always really guys starting with owner outward. Have the salon to work code for the successful nomination and does not use the neighbor to any group. So that nomination would go through to see what was highest focus. So you'd have to update nominations, maybe have one of those form draft deadlines, go under the revision process, look at both, and then it will be scheduled for the update meeting and move through the process exactly like we described.
Hi, Caitlin. I'm Steve Wright. Talked to you earlier because I'm teaching a class at the museum right now about places that are on the National Register. Question I have for you is, the art museum was once a federal building, a post office, but now it's a nonprofit, or it's an art museum. So is that a public or a private situation?
So, but yes, it depends who owns it. We own it right on. We own the
They're saying the city owns it,
building it.
so that would be a public building at that.
Correct.
And then if the auditorium or other buildings on the campus here, is a school a public, or how's that work?
Yeah, the school is a public.
Okay, so you have to go through the public rules in terms of the nomination and what you can do and what you can't do.
The nomination process uses the regulations.
Yeah, and more regulations on the public. Okay.
So the Egyptian theaters, building is but collections and these substations.
So you want more?
Are there any further questions before we let Caitlin go for the night? Wonderful. And thank you again. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll be in contact as we kind of move along this process.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your time and your questions tonight.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
I guess you can't, but again,